Howdy folks, I'm the Partisan Ranger, and this will be part 2 in my series on cavalry, the history of and the use in modern warfare. Now, in my previous video, two of the topics I wanted to discuss the most, but simply didn't have the time for, was the discussion of infrastructure and its effect on warfare, as well as the locations and geography that best fit the usage of cavalry. Now, as discussed in my previous video, the reason why the Western Front of the First World War was so disastrous for cavalry was mostly due for incompetence of overall command, as well as for the fact that the Western Front was the only region of the world with the infrastructure and industrial capacity capable of supporting trench warfare at the scale and destructiveness that it existed in. Now, an example that Patton gives in his discussions upon the Western Front was that if one even remotely attempted to fight the kind of war, such as trench warfare, in any other place of the world, it would inevitably fail as a main form of battlefield doctrine, and this inevitability of its failure was decreed by the mobility of units that can simply just go around them. This wasn't possible on the Western Front because the Western Front had the ability for all these nations to turn almost half a continent into an actual fortress. As well as something I briefly mentioned was the fact that there were wars similar to the Western Front. The Crimean War and parts of the American Civil War had their fair share of trench warfare and barbed wire. One could even make the argument that the United States fought the only war that could genuinely be compared to the Western Front well before it ever happened. We arguably went into the First World War with the only army that still had surviving members that had fought in trenches. Things like the Siege of Richmond, the sieges of Vicksburg, battles of that nature very much had conditions not dissimilar from the Western Front. Vast, unending miles of trench lines filled to the brim with men, artillery, fixed fighting positions that were impossible to attack with cavalry. If a Civil War commander was smart enough not to attack a trench with cavalry, then we can very much chalk the First World War up to incompetence. Now, interestingly, the reason why I bring all this up is that, unlike the Western Front, the reason why the Union Army somehow couldn't storm Richmond, despite the fact that it was only 107 miles from Washington, D.C., had very little to do with the defenses built around the city of Richmond, and everything to do with the fact that when they tried to march an army towards Richmond, the Confederacy marched an army toward a target just as dear to them, just as dear to the Union. The mobility of Confederate armies was the reason why the war lasted as long as it did. And I very much believe that Patton is calling upon that without ever referencing it by name in his reports to the War Department, where he unequivocally states that any attempts at trench warfare being applied to anywhere on the North American continent would very quickly fall apart, simply because even the most industrialized and city-centric states of the Union are still too vast, too big of places to effectively turn into geographical fortresses by virtue of just pumping men and materiel into there until it's an unassailable piece of ground. And he remarks, when discussing this, that all one would have to do when commanding an army against a defensively natured opponent in North America would simply be outmaneuver him. There is too much land for you to get bogged down in a slow slugging match like trench warfare, when you can, quite simply, take your men and go around them. No matter how far you have to march, they can't cover that distance and keep you out of where you want to go, unless they've simply got more men than you have. And so this really is why infrastructure plays such a vital role when discussing any facet of warfare, not just cavalry, but armor, infantry, aerial combat. Geography will always play a part in why battles are won or lost, and sometimes even why entire wars are won or lost. And this, at its core, stems from, well, basic knowledge of your surroundings. The people who know the land best and know how to exploit it to their advantage will usually come out on top in a conflict. People would like to point out Afghanistan as one of the shining pillars of an example, but for its own reasons, Afghanistan isn't as much of an empire killer as people want to think. Mongolia. Anyway, and I would like to move from infrastructure and how it actually supports trench warfare into the actual talk of geography itself. More precisely, Patton actually discusses what would make up ideal cavalry terrain. Now, when one comes to mind, thinking to cavalry, you think of cavalry charges, which would require relatively flat, unimpeded ground. And Patton actually says this, that the stereotype of good cavalry ground is vast miles of unfenced pasture land. But he points out that even when he was a young cavalryman, this didn't really make any sense, because they had rifles, good rifles. And so you were really only making a cavalry charge in the specific circumstances that required it. Now, while Patton believed those circumstances were far more numerous than a lot of people would like to admit, they were still there. They were a cavalry charge was a situational weapon that required specific circumstances to be effective, and a good officer's job was to determine when and where those circumstances applied. But Patton argues that ideal cavalry terrain would in fact be heavily mountainous and forested regions, specifically because it would conceal their movements from aerial reconnaissance and artillery spotters. So you'll have cover and concealment provided by the geography itself that's disguising your movements, and so for a highly mobile force that can go where it pleases and strike at will, the enemy not knowing where you are is vital. And Patton emphasizes this again by saying that if there were a war on the North American continent, it would be, and I'm paraphrasing, a cavalryman's paradise, simply because it has wonderful cavalry terrain, it has vast amounts of land that you can traverse as a horseman, and simply because of that alone, no amount of technical advantage is going to take away from the fact that it is ideal cavalry ground. And Patton, presumably because this was a letter to the War Department, was attempting to head off arguments before they could be made. And he clearly states that why would cavalry be useful if it is limited to such highly situational geography like forested and mountainous regions? And he heads this off by stating that it is the logical choice for cavalry, not just tactically, but because that's where the enemy will be. He argued that all of the same reasons as to why cavalry will have to take to the mountains and woods to be an effective fighting force are the same reasons why infantry and artillery and tanks will eventually have to take to the mountains and woods for all the same reasons. It's because you can avoid detection more easily. You can more easily fight back in a defensive nature. You can more easily outmaneuver an enemy that is in the mountains if you know those mountains. It really is working off of the presumption that armies would make the logical decision and stop fighting in open fields, butchering each other in the middle of nowhere. They would actually start using the terrain to full effect and not relying on the weight of numbers anymore. Now, rather unfortunately, the closest example we have to this in terms of recent conflicts would be the Vietnam War, which my discussions on guerrilla warfare versus insurgency will be a while from now, but what I will say very shortly about the Vietnam War is that it was won and lost by two things: terrain and the willingness to sacrifice. Vietnam War was won by the North Vietnamese because they knew that they were willing to sacrifice every soldier they had till they won. And that was simply a commitment no one else was willing to make. It's why they defeated the French, it's why they defeated the Japanese, and it's why they beat us. Now, but that is truly for another time. Back to cavalry. Because all aspects of warfare would have to move to terrain that suited it and gave it some protection from artillery and aircraft, which I think was a rather good prediction on Patton's part, considering that even when he was writing these papers, aircraft weren't that great, and the idea of relying on aerial bombardment to defeat an enemy didn't really exist yet, but he suspected that it would, rather accurately. The same exact pieces of terrain that would help hide you from enemy artillery will help hide you from an enemy airstrike, both in terms of cover and in terms of, well, if they can't see you, they can't hit you. Aside from shrapnel, but that's a different conversation in and of itself. Ultimately, cavalry would be best suited for a forest, if only because of the fact that it's easier to get through the woods on a horse than most other places. We'd be talking about even units of men at a squad level who have a state of mobility that would be unquestioned. It'd be unquestioningly superior to fight on horseback in a forest than it would be to rely on a convoy of Humvees to get from point A to B. Especially if we're talking about an enemy that basically squirreled itself up into the forests and mined every, back trail and roadway that they weren't explicitly using, and just waited for the enemy to come. If they can cut across the country on horseback and quite literally blaze new trails to supply themselves with, and force the enemy to rely off of old, maps for fire trails, then even if they lose, that's an enemy that has dug itself in like a tick, and it's going to take rivers of blood to dig him out. And I genuinely believe Patton was drawing on the American Civil War, despite the fact that he never said the words aloud. I'm not quite sure why, because there was very clear implication in his writings that he was referencing groups like Morgan's Raiders, like, I'd like to say Jeb Stuart, but Jeb Stuart really spent most of his time acting in support of an army. Even when he screwed up and went off by himself, he was still doing a lot of damage, but it was all in the service to the army he was attached to. I suppose a better example of perhaps the kind of warfare Patton envisioned would be General Joe Shelby. He's not exactly well known, but he was a hell of a cavalryman, and he had a tendency to just show up in places that were originally conceived to be not possible to show up in. His entire doctrine of warfare simply relied upon, no matter how bad the terrain is, I'm going to show up behind the enemy and kick him in the ass. And he even did this by being willing to dismount all of his troops. They were predominantly a cavalry regiment, but he was willing to dismount and fight his infantry as long as it won him the battle. After fighting in northern Arkansas, fighting in some swamps, he and his men spent a day and a half wading through waist-deep swamp just to sneak into a Union camp and slit some throats and back out again. After that, his men started saying that in order to be a dragoon in Shelby's unit, you had to be half horse and half alligator. But when it comes to cavalrymen, I don't suppose it's a surprise that Shelby was a cousin of John Hunt Morgan, who in and of himself was a good cavalryman. But at its core, there was clear influences from the American Civil War that colored Patton's writings about cavalry warfare, but more precisely, his own time. Patton was a cavalryman. He saw the Western Front. And I find it very telling that a man who commanded those primitive tanks on the Western Front by, leading them through on foot while they're in the tanks, he's on foot guiding them through the shells, that after all that, he still thought cavalry had a place. We'll talk about this more in the future. I'm the Partisan Ranger. You folks have a good day.